If you're honest, one of the biggest fears that you have is that you feel like you've wasted time. All the skills, all the things that you've learned, all the experiences, the skills that you built, all of that feels like pretty much it's ended up with nothing and you're not sure which path to go. I just want you to know that if God is calling you, truly calling you, then nothing in your life is by accident. Scripture says that all things work together for good for those who are the called according to his purpose. So we're going to look at the life of one of the key central figures of Scripture, Moses, and see a lot of practical examples how that teaches us about our life and experience and how none of the delays, the detours are by mistake. Let's have a read of Acts 7. And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and in deeds. And when he was full 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. And seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended him and avenged him that was oppressed and smote the Egyptian. For he supposed his brethren would have understood how that God by his hand would have delivered them. But they understood not. Here we get some key information that even in the time when Moses was first being called, when he was still in the palaces of Egypt, he knew the call of God's life was that he was going to be a deliverer for the children of Israel. Just like you could be knowing that there's a calling on your life, knowing that God ultimately has a plan for you, but you're not sure how it's going to play out. And like Moses, sometimes we can force God's hand or try and make it happen in the way that we think it should happen, or how it's going to plan out according to our education, according to our skills, our knowledge, our position. Have you ever tried to take matters in your own hands and tried to use your experience, your skill, your knowledge to make God's plan happen? Let me know in the comment section below. I'd love to hear your experience. Moses was obviously in a position in the kingdom in Egypt, and by that he thought that he can use his power, his status, his strength physically to handle the matter. But we see that that's not how it played out. A key thing that we know, according to Scripture here, is that Moses was well learned and he was mighty in education. The education of the Egyptians is literally a pattern that even today's schooling system still even copies. But Moses was there in the original system and he was well learned in that. Matter of fact, he was mighty in words, which is amazing because when we look at Moses' life later on, we see that later on he said to God when he was being called 40 years later from this time, that he said he cannot speak. So we see that there has to be some change and that some stuff that God has to strip off first before we could be eligible to be used. Because think about it, if Moses was successful in delivering the people from the way that he saw fit, according to the education that he had, then he could get the glory. He's doing it in his own strength and he's the one that delivered the people from the hand of the Egyptians. But we see that God had a bigger plan for his life, that first it needed to be stripped from the education, the skills, the knowledge, the understanding that he had. We see that Moses was a man that was passionate. Passion we see from before, that he was somebody that was touched by the injustice that he's seeing, the misuse of his people, even though obviously secretly the people didn't know, the Egyptians didn't know that he was a Hebrew. But he was still touched, right? And yet again, we see a good characteristic that God used within him. But there was still some stuff that had to be taken away. And that's just like with us. There's some stuff in our life that though we're passionate, though we're zealous, we have to be patient, know that God is doing the trimming. God's going to do the changing in us. And they said, an Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds and also drew water enough for us and watered the flock. For context, this is after Moses fled because he knew that Pharaoh wanted to kill him. After he fled, he went into the wilderness and he met who later on would become his wife. But we see that there were shepherds that was bullying these 7 sisters. And Moses was somebody that, yet again, with the passion that he had, didn't like to see injustice, and he wanted to deliver people. He delivered these 7 sisters from shepherds, males that were bullying them, and then they drew water for their flock. So yet again, we see that this is part of the beginning of the life of Moses, how God was training him through the passion that he had. He was a deliverer. He had the heart of a deliverer. But still, there was some education within him, the education of the Egyptians, that had to be trimmed before he'll be the perfect candidate to deliver the children of Israel. Scripture goes on and says, now when Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, he led the flock to the backside of the desert and came to the mountain of God, even Horeb. So now we see a transitional change. Before Moses met his wife, we see that he wasn't a shepherd. Now, due to what seemingly seems like a random circumstance in his life, he bumped into his wife who was keeping flock, and now he's a shepherd. And the interesting thing, we see in scripture that shepherds, according to the experience of the Egyptians, was a shame. It was a job that was for people that was uneducated. It was a job for people that was unskilled. That's why for him now to end up as one of the princes of Egypt, now being a shepherd, it was a humble beginning. He was going to the low of the lows, if you will. He was a king that now is operating as a pauper, to put it in context. So though the experience was seemingly negative, and he must have been wondering what God has in plan for his life at this point. Just like you may be wondering, wait a minute, how am I here? I know God has a plan for me, I know God has a calling, but how am I here and why am I here? But we see that the characteristics of a shepherd was what God was going to use for him to be able to lead the children of Israel as a leader. But the amazing thing that we see here is that the education that he had in Egypt had to be retrained. Sometimes we're relying on our experiences or how we think our life should pan out. But God's saying, strip all that back. I'm going to put you back to humility. I'm going to humble you by circumstances. And all of this is for the space of 40 years. This is before he was called by the burning bush. The burning bush happens at this point where we see that Moses had the encounter where he was told that God is going to use him to deliver the people of Israel. And the amazing thing is that at that point we now see that Moses didn't even think that he had it within himself. And then that's when God said, you know what? Now you're the perfect candidate. Before, Moses was mighty in words and in deeds, and he thought that he had the ability to do it. 40 years later now, life humbled him. And now God's saying, now you are the perfect candidate for me. So just like with us, sometimes you want to be in control of everything. Sometimes we want to see how things panned out. Our education, our skills is what we're relying on. But we cannot be relying in this life according to our direction. Man plans and God laughs. So many times we can plan in our life and we could be depressed, stressed, lose peace because we're thinking it's not panning out as we wish. But if we know that there's a calling on our life, we should be people that are trusting God by faith that no matter what's happening to us, all things is working out for good. There's another amazing thing that we see here, is that before Moses had the grand encounter with God at Mount Horeb, 40 years or so after this experience, when Moses was 40 years old, he left Egypt. When he was 80 years old, he was met by God in the encounter at the burning bush. And then we see there, he had a one-to-one experience at Mount Horeb, the exact same place where he would receive the 10 Commandments with God, with the fire and the flames and the whole nation behind him. But we see that the private encounter that he had with God is what was ready to set him up publicly for the grand calling. And that's just like with us. The word says, when you pray, go in secret, go to your closet, and your Father, which seeth in secret, shall reward you openly. So the preparation and the wondering that we may feel like we're doing in life, God is actually saying that if you spend that one-to-one time with me, I'm preparing you. I'm training you. I want to bring you to a place of full dependency on me, God saying, and then that is going to make you elevated publicly. So what do we get from this? The lessons in our life, the negative experiences, is actually training. It's training us not only for the characteristics, but also for the experiences we're going to face later on in life. We see that later on, Moses spent 40 years with the children of Israel in the wilderness. This is a second 40-year period that he spent in the wilderness. But this time he was close with God. This time he was fully trained by God, and he was prepared for what God had in store for him based on his one-to-one time of wandering. He spent 40 years wandering with the people, the children of Israel, many years after this. So the negative that you have, trust and obey that it's God that's preparing you for what he sees later on in your life. The things that you're learning today is actually experiences that's going to be very valuable to what you're going to experience later on in your life. If you found this teaching, this talk useful, don't forget to like and share, and you're more than welcome to follow along with the channel. Thank you for watching. God bless and keep you. Peace.